Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be talking with Jean-Frédéric Caron, the Executive Director of the Orchestre de l'Agora, an ensemble that uses music as a tool for sustainable social change. He's also the recipient of the ARDI 2022 Prize for Innovation in Cultural Philanthropy. The Orchestre de l'Agora has organized a fundraising concert on June 12th, and they plan to donate proceeds to environmental organizations, including Sierra Club Canada. Together, we discuss how musicians work to promote environmental awareness and to make music more accessible to the public, the way we perceive our environment through sound, and why it's so important to make sure younger musicians have the ability to continue their work. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio at 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. For those who don't know you, who are you and what do you do?
Well, I'm Jean-Frédéric Caron. I'm based in Montreal, Canada, and I'm actually the Executive Director of Orchestre de l'Agora for the last 5 years already, almost 5 years in a couple of weeks. It's a great orchestra, a great organization, so I'm really happy to talk about it today. But me personally, I have a background in music. I'm a violinist, so I studied violin until 10 years ago. So I've done it to I would say university level. And then after I switched and I did a bachelor in public relations, and I've been working in the arts industry as an art administrator for the last 10 years. So before being at Agora, I was at the Laval Symphony Orchestra, so just north of Montreal, another orchestra that has a mission to just bring music closer to its community. But I've known the orchestra for quite some years at the Orchestre de l'Agora, because I played in the first concert as a violinist, and I've done a couple of concerts with Nicolas Ellis, the conductor and the founder of the orchestra. So it was always an organization that I really liked, and I liked its mission. So when I saw that they opened the position of executive director a few years ago, I was really interested, and I've been fortunate to win the position a couple of years back. So that's the general outline of who I am.
Fellow public relations person, which is kind of nice to chat to on the podcast. So you're working a lot with different orchestras that seem to be their goal is to bring music to the public.
I would say that the Laval Symphony was more of a generalist type of orchestra. So they were playing, doing a lot of concerts, and their goal was they were really focused on education and music education, and go in schools and bring musicians in schools and do some mentorship with young kids. And Agora is really socially focused. So the mission of the orchestra has been, it has evolved since the last 10 years, but it's to use music as a tool for social change and put the musician at the center of that change. So Orchestre de l'Agora, how it all started 10 years ago, it's in Montreal. We had a huge, and in all of Quebec, actually, we had a huge student strike in 2012 because government wanted to raise tuition for universities and for school. So for 6 months, 250,000 students were on strike. And Nicolas Ellis, the conductor, was on strike as well. And he just brought a couple of friends that were studying music with him and did 2 concerts that were sold out. And that was supporting that movement back then. And It was such a hit that in 2013, Orchestre de l'Agora was founded on that idea of doing concert and supporting causes. So supporting community organizations like l'Itinéraire, who helps homeless people, or Fondation Rêve d'Enfant, who helps kids with disabilities. And all the concerts that were organized, the ticket proceeds were given back to those community organizations. And it was working when the musicians were students and doing it as volunteers. But then 5 years ago, the mission kind of switched, and because we found that the link between the organizations and the musicians was really quick. It was like for a concert, and then we were giving a check, and that's it. So 5 years ago, we switched it to just position the musician as an actor of social change with music, through music. So we did a lot of of projects in with the organizations and work with them throughout the year. For example, we have a mentorship program that is still active since then with Share the Warmth Foundation in Pointe Saint-Charles. I would say a more disadvantaged neighborhood in Montreal, and they have a music program with that foundation, and our musicians go there every month to give music lessons and do some mentorship with their music groups and teach. So that's an example of projects that we've done since then. And we also have another program that every month, I like to say that we send musicians in prison because it's basically what we do. But we have a program, a partnership with the Bordeaux prison in Montreal. And we do what we call concert workshops in front of 75 inmates each month. And the goal of that is to help them rehabilitate. And it's a minimum security prison. So the goal is to use music and access the inmates' emotions and use it to just help them basically and give them something to make them reflect. And so, yeah, that's all part of what we do.
And I'm just thinking on that note, because it's interesting. One of the questions I want to ask you today is like the connections between music and the environment, but I'm seeing something more fundamental there too, because when I think about music and the experiences I've had personally in my life, I mean, I played in a concert band in high school, right? And the peace that could bring.
What was your instrument?
Saxophone. I was
Great.
tenor saxophone. Yeah, I was never the best musician, frankly, performer, but I really loved composition. And to play in an ensemble and even just to play music, it was this thing that brought me a lot of peace. And the other place where I actually find that peace is in the environment. When I go out to a park and I sit for a while, and both have this social justice element, because on the one hand, with the environment, it can be hard to access, and particularly as we start to lose more green spaces, it gets even harder and harder for people to just get out to the places where there are.
There's a lot of it's a great point, because there's a lot of cities in the world where it's hard to even find a park and enjoy nature. And here in Berlin, because I'm in Berlin right now, and I'm very fortunate to be here, and there's a lot of parks. But even in Montreal, we have a lot of trees, but the parks are so full and they're so small, and I feel we're missing parks when I compare our city to other cities. So you're right. It's not necessarily easy to access nature, even in cities and elsewhere.
And it's also not easy to access music, and it's great to see sort of like those two things, because we do a lot of work with, for instance, trying to help kids access nature, right? So to see that sort of a parallel in some of the work that you're doing with trying to make sure people can actually access music and can be a part of it. Yeah, there's something there too with, bird song and just the way that nature is such an auditory experience as opposed to just a visual one.
Exactly.
Before we dive too much into the more theoretical stuff, you have a concert coming up, the Gala de la Terre. Can you tell me a little bit about that and what it is it's going to be doing?
Sure. And so we're very passionate actually about that project, because it's I would say the project that connects us to the initial mission of the orchestra, which was to raise funds for organizations. And so it's part of the switch that we did 5 years ago. We actually chose to keep the environment as our main cause to support, because it's such an urgency to help our planet and talk about raising awareness about environment and protecting the environment. So 5 years ago, actually, we started working on the first edition of Gala de la Terre, which was supposed to be on April 2020. And unfortunately, as you know, we had the pandemic in March 2020. So everything was pretty much canceled for the in-person events, but we still raised $138,000 for 3 organizations. One of them was Sierra Club. So we still managed to do like an online concert, but it wasn't the same thing as what was initially planned. But that was the first online edition. And then in 2022, that's when we did the second edition, with the first one in front of a public and with the Mahler tree. So basically the goal of Gala de la Terre is to organize a huge concert and use music to inspire people about climate change and about protecting the planet. And like what we do in prison, we use music to just initiate change. It's a bit the same idea, to just use music and initiate change and talk about the cause in the media. For example, we're about to have a concert on June 12th. It's the third edition of Gala de la Terre at Maison Symphonique. And Nicolas Ellis, one of the ambassadors, is Natasha Canapé-Fontaine, who's a Innu poet. She's pretty known here in Quebec. And they're both going to go in media and talk about the gala, but also talk about the project that we support. One of them is from Sierra Club, but we're also supporting the GREMM, so the mammal. I know the name in French, so I wouldn't
There
try
are also
to.
so many acronyms in the environmental movement that it's hard for me on a daily basis to keep track of all.
I wouldn't know how to. Well, pretty much they're focused on mammals and protecting belugas in the Southern River.
Yeah.
But their acronym is GREMM, and the third one is WWF Canada. Each 2 years, we try to support different organizations. Sierra Club is one of the organizations that we've kept throughout the years, but it always changes a little bit. But what I was about to say is, yes, there's the concert, there's the 2,000 people in the hall, and we try to just pass a message with music for that event. But prior to that, we have artists going in the media and talking about the project that we support and why we do it and why it's important to do it. And that's also part of raising awareness and what we try to do and try to encourage with Gala de la Terre. And yes, so 2 years ago, we did the first in-person edition. We were very happy and maybe lucky and surprised to win an Opus Prize of the musical event of the year 2 years ago.
Right.
So throughout all the concerts that there was in that year in Quebec, they chose that event to be the musical event of the year. So it's something that we hope is going to help attract people this year. And since then, the orchestra has pretty much evolved a lot since 2022, to be honest. And even our conductor was named music director in an orchestra in France, probably thanks to Gala de la Terre. So it's something that also helps the orchestra, but it's a very interesting project and a great concert each 2 years. And we're gonna do the next edition in 2026, hopefully still with Sierra Club or other organizations. But the goal is just to do it every 2 years and use music to inspire people about climate change.
Full disclosure, this is in part promoting an event in which we're benefiting from. And thank you so much for inviting us to.
We're happy to support you.
It's also just great to hear about the way that provides that avenue for talking about environment. I guess on a more personal level, what worries you about the environmental destruction that we're seeing, and what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Maybe kids. And when I think about even my nieces that are 4 years old and 9 years old, how they're very into, like, they're very aware of that cause, and they're very of, how important it is to protect our planet. And I guess what gives me hope is their generation and the ones following, and even our generation. I'm 34, and it's something that we talk about a lot. That's what gives me hope. I guess it's hard to stay hopeful all the time because there's so much negative things happening, but I still feel that it's something that is discussed in every field more and more, how it's important. Sustainability is important even in the arts field. I mean, it's all part of every organization now to do to have a développement durable.
Sustainable development, yeah.
Sustainable development, and yeah.
And I was actually going to ask about that because it must be kind of difficult when you're dealing with like a large musical group like an orchestra. There must be particular sustainability challenges that you face in transportation, I would think, in location, and in how you use time and energy.
But there's very simple things that we've implemented in our day-to-day activities. For example, to just serve vegan food for the last 5 years. Every cocktail we host, every event that we organize, we serve exclusively vegan food, and no one ever complained about that, because as we know, vegan food has a lower carbon emission and a lower impact on the planet. So I mean, that's something very simple to do. There's very good options and restaurants that serve vegan food. So I mean, that's one example of something simple to do and that any organization can do. And in music, I mean, you're right. It's sometimes maybe harder to just implement it in every way and everything we do, but to take the train, and if we do a tour, to take the train instead of taking the plane, that's something very feasible. And yeah, to just like implement small things like this. But I've been talking earlier today with someone who was telling me a lot of organization and music organization in Europe, their source of energy is often not clean, and just be aware of choosing a clean source of energy for electricity. And it's something that everyone can do here in Europe, but it's like something easy to do to just switch to like a cleaner choice of energy. So many little things that can be done.
Solar powered orchestras.
Hope. Your question was hope, and I guess I'm still hopeful still, but yeah, I mean, I feel it's just discussed more and more the subject. And I could ask you the same question: what gives you hope?
You're talking about future generations. The other day we did a podcast, and it actually just aired with one of our Wild Child programs, and this program that gets kids outdoors. And I think actually it was one of the focuses of fundraising that you were doing last year with the Mahler Fifth Symphony, if I recall.
Mahler Third, yeah.
Mahler's Third, okay. And just did a podcast on this series with one of the coordinators there, and they were talking about them, not only what they're providing to kids and their understanding, but how those kids are actually starting to interact with we're well into the impacts of climate change, but they're interacting with the impacts directly. Like severe storm, Hurricane Fiona came through, and they went out afterwards to go see if their favorite tree had survived, right? And it's like, and in my work, it's easy to sometimes become pessimistic or to lose your energy, with what you're doing. But when you hear something like that, it's like, you go, well, I have to have hope. I have to go do that. It's not a choice that I get. It's a responsibility that I have to go out and try to do something. So I would say that, among other things. I think also just the fact that we are seeing a lot of big victories for the environment at the same time as we're seeing a lot of threats. We're making a lot of progress. So yeah,
you're right. And it's a bit the message that we try to send with the Gala that is that we're trying to send a positive message about like why it's important to protect the planet and what is so beautiful about nature that like we need to preserve that, right? So why are belugas so important in the St. Lawrence River, and why do we need to like protect huge ecosystems in Canada? I mean, so that's a bit like the twist, that we're not trying to just oppress people about those threats that you mentioned. We're trying to just send a positive message and so show like it's important and we have to act. And it's like, yeah, it's just so like we're all on the same planet, so so we need to preserve it, right? So yeah.
Totally. And so to jump from that into the piece itself, you're going to be doing Strauss's Alpine Symphony. Was there a particular reason why you picked Strauss's Alpine Symphony for the event?
So the music choices are made by the artistic director Nicolas Ellis, and that symphony, like the Mahler Third Symphony, is very inspired by nature. So the Alpine Symphony is inspired by the Alps, obviously, and so every movement is a different, depicts a different aspect of nature, pretty much. So the work is very completely inspired by nature, and it's just obviously spectacular. There's 100 musicians on stage, and it's very intense and very inspiring. And so that was the choice, to just we choose huge, majestic works that are inspired by nature. And then the rest of the program is also very interesting because we have a new work that we've commissioned to a composer called Claudie Bertounès, who's a local Quebec composer, and she's mostly involved in video game music and film music, but it's her first work for orchestra in front of an audience. And she actually is doing a work mixed with electro-acoustic elements. For example, beluga sounds that have been taken from the St. Lawrence River, and she's going to mix it with music. So she was really inspired, even with the material of the music, by their environment for her work. And the third piece, Vizendanglida, so it's poems that all have a link, in a way, to nature too, with an Eno soprano called Elisabeth Saint-Gelais. She's the CBC Radio-Canada classical music revelation of this year, and she just won a very huge competition called the Prix d'Europe and the COC competition in Ottawa. So she's a very like rising star in the classical scene. So it's going to be like 3 different pieces and a second part with the Alpine Symphony that is very spectacular and showcases like nature pretty much, but the beauty of nature and the beauty of the Alps and the beauty of mountains while you ask your second question, because they're all related to an aspect of nature. So right now, 22 parts, but I need to I need to translate them.
Well, I was going to say, because there's something I think we like the piece in general. When I listened to it the other day for the first time, and it has this sort of epicness that reminded me a lot of some of the like writing of the early environmental movement and the way that the early, I should say, Western environmental movement, and the way that they kind of depicted nature. There was an interesting sort of, I don't know, sense that I got from the piece that was similar, and again, nature is this very epic thing, and I think that was the case as well when you did Mahler's Third, right? Like I also felt that nature was like this epic sort of thing. It's something that definitely you feel when you're out, you're out amongst mountains, right? Like when you're out
You're right.
amongst somewhere that you can. Again, I think that's why, like for me, nature is it's an auditory experience, right? Like it's an experience of smell. You smell things, and without those smells, you can't really be in the same place anymore. You see things, and those are aspects of nature,
Exactly.
but
You're
you
just
hear
brought
it.
elsewhere. You're brought elsewhere, and you're just like in the moment. And it's the goal of going to a classical music concert. You're just completely elsewhere for an
Yeah.
hour or two, and then, for example, one of the movements is called Unflowery Meadows. Another one is at the waterfall. Another one is sunrise. Another one is on the summit, where the sun gradually darkens. So they're all related to an aspect of nature, and what it is to just be in nature in general, and homage in a way to nature, that
Yeah.
piece.
Well, the other day I sat outside, and of course it's starting to warm up in Montreal. And I sat outside and I listened to birdsong in the background, and I suddenly remembered how much I'd not thought about it. I'd not thought about that sound being there. And now that it's summer, it's back, and it suddenly like reawakened the memory of summer for me, this constant hum that was in the background. I think is easy to ignore for that reason. On the 12th too in person, because that's a whole different experience too, right? And to having those evocations of nature. You touched on something that I do just want to go back to as a quick end to our discussion today. Supporting younger composers, musicians, maybe people who are getting a start. You mentioned working in the video game industry, doing music for that. Actually, when I was initially thinking of going into composition as a field, that was one of the fields that came up. It was like nowadays a lot of demand is for video games, movies, that kind of side of things. But having that opportunity to actually have a piece played in public live, obviously a huge opportunity. How do we support younger composers, younger musicians in doing this sort of work, particularly the sort of work that's tied so closely to environmental courses or other courses?
It's a very good question. A very good question. Sorry. There's actually a thing called the Canadian Music Center. They're the main source that supports young composers, but there's also different organizations like the SOCAN Foundation. There's here in Montreal, there's two organizations that are supporting young composers. For example, one of them is Le Vivier, and they support every young composer in Quebec. Another one is called the Société de musique contemporaine du Québec, so Contemporary Music of Quebec Society. There's many organizations like this that supports young composers that want to work in the industry, in the music industry, and we work with some of them regularly every year. But that's a way to support composers, is to support those type of organizations that have that mission. I would say that's the best way to do it. But yeah, you're right. You have to be very creative nowadays if you want to work in that industry,
Mm.
and yeah, it's still possible though.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. It's something that creates a lot of joy for a lot of people.
An important thing I didn't necessarily mention about Gala de la Terre is that yes, it's going to be a great show, and people are going to be able to enjoy it. And there's also 75 choristers from the Petit Chanteur du Mont-Royal. They're a
Right.
great youth choir. But the thing that is pretty incredible about Gala de la Terre is the ticket proceeds are 100% giving back to the environmental organization. So when you buy a ticket, you directly contribute to supporting the organizations that you support, which is kind of awesome, because you pay for a great music experience, but then you support
Yeah.
as well the planet, which is something not necessarily easy to do. So yeah.
Yeah.
So
And you get to indirectly support a lot of, again, younger musicians, composers who are making their way through things. This work, I hope that you're doing in general, bringing music to people, because it can be something that I think some people immediately think of as inaccessible, right? But it's funny, like I grew up in a very rural place in some ways, but we had a very strong musical basis, right? Like that was something that was very important, and I think it's wonderful to be able to bring that to people. Just before we go, how can people find out more about the event?
there's a website, actually an official website called galadelaterre.com. So that's the easiest way to buy tickets to see the organizations and the project that we support with that event and find more info on the artists that are going to be on stage. And so that's the easiest way to find us. We're also on sale through the Place des Arts website. So you can also find the info on the event there. And for the Orchestre de l'Agora and what we do in prison and all the other concerts that we do throughout the year, that is orchestreagora.com. So every info is there. But you're completely right that it's so important to make music accessible to everyone. And I'm always surprised actually when we go in prison, because most of the inmates, they cry, and I'm gonna finish on this, but they cry and they're super touched, because I would say almost 100% of them never saw a live musician, a live classical musician in front of them. And some of them, when they're out of prison, they come to our concerts, and sometimes they recognize us, and they come talk to us, and they actually, it's very easy to enjoy music when you just have an access to it. And sometimes people feel they're not entitled, or they're not allowed to go to a classical music concert, but it's very easy to like it. So yeah, just, I guess, even if you think you're not gonna like it, just come and we'll see. You will. So yeah.
Well, it's funny. I remember going to the Handel Museum at one point, which is in London, and there was actually an exhibit. This was when I was very young, and there was an exhibit that actually talked about how at a nightclub at one point, somebody had halfway through switched out the music that they were playing with Handel and just put it in, and like nobody noticed. Everybody just kept dancing. They really liked it. It's true, right? I think so much of the inaccessibility of particularly classical music that people perceive comes from that sense of, oh, well, that music isn't meant for me. So I'm so glad that you're able to introduce it to people in a way that gives them that, because it is such emotional music.
You're right. Anyways, it was great talking to you and meeting you, and hopefully some people are going to hear this and come in Montreal on June 12th. We're going to have a great time with us.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So just jumping in to do the Q&A for the end of this episode, and we had a question that came in that I thought would pair really well with some of the things that we talked about in this episode, especially around whales. And the question is, why are whales so important to ecosystems? Like, I get they do something, but what? So there are a number of reasons, of course, to appreciate whales, from their intelligence to what we see when we go out and see them, to the role they've played throughout our history in our literature and in the way we talk about the ocean. Whales also, of course, do have a biological place within the ecosystems in which they exist. Whales redistribute nutrients and help maintain a balance in the ocean ecosystems, in part because they eat a lot. They're big eaters, and that's part of why they're so important to those ecosystems, that they provide balance. And when they pass on, they actually drop to the bottom of the sea in some cases, and they create small ecosystems that can last for decades just around where the whale has fallen. There are unique species that actually exist, it seems, off of these whale falls that are very important to redistributing nutrients within the ecosystem. I've seen some research that talks about them as having a role within the carbon system as well within the ocean. And Sierra Club Canada has been particularly active in the case of the blue whale and North Atlantic right whale in trying to promote conservation. And if you are interested, there are a series of resources on these on our website, and our work, including webinars and articles and how we have worked to protect these whale species. Our Atlantic chapter has also been particularly active on this file. It's worth checking it out at sierraclub.ca. Also a reminder before we end today that on that same website, sierraclub.ca, we have tons of petitions, other actions, events, and regular news updates and ways you can take action. Just go and sign up on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weeklies on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.